On the 13th of December, 1945, inside of Hamlin Prison, Elisabeth Volkenrath was told that she was to be executed imminently. She was one of the most brutal and notorious women who worked inside of the concentration camps of World War II, and it was British executioner Albert Pierrepoint who secured the noose around her neck. But she was not like most guards. She was rather senior, and the actions of Elisabeth Volkenrath led to her death sentence, and she was someone who remained a virulent Nazi until the end of her life. Elisabeth Volkenrath was born as Elisabeth Mulau, and she had a very large family. When she left school, she worked as a nanny and also a cook. However, her early life was dominated by the Nazis and by the youth groups that she was involved in. She had been part of the League of German Girls, and many teenage girls joined this, and they were brainwashed further by the Nazis in this. Girls were taught how to keep a good household, but also how to raise as many children as possible for Hitler's empire. Later in life, many of these women would be rewarded with mothers' crosses for the children that they had. But Elisabeth Volkenrath joined the SS Rettwein in the October of 1941, and this was a collection of women who were deployed by the SS in different roles and jobs. She, however, wanted to work for the Nazis, and with this she was sent to a concentration camp for the first time, to work as a female guard. She began her training at Ravensbrück, an all-female camp, which was where many other women, such as Irma Grazer, learnt how to become beastly guards, and Maria Mandel and other teachers taught them how to terrorise people. Many of the women who trained at Ravensbrück were later sent on to other camps, and this was the fate that awaited Elisabeth, as she was sent to Auschwitz in the March of 1942. This was the largest concentration and extermination site of the Second World War, and there were many women sent there to oversee the women's camp which opened at the camp. To begin with, she worked inside of the tailor's shop in the camp and oversaw the prisoners who worked here. But then in the August of 1942, she was sent to the women's camp. This was based at Auschwitz-Birkenau, and this was the main extermination part of Auschwitz, but whilst here, Elisabeth Volkenrath caught typhus and was forced to spend some time in the hospital recovering. She was then given a job inside of the parcel post of the camp, and she was in charge of 30 prisoners who processed the different packages that arrived inside of Auschwitz. Most of the food and other resources were not given to the prisoners as they arrived from the Red Cross, and were instead given to the guards. But in the September of 1944, she was then sent back to Auschwitz I, and she would then be named the camp leader of the women's area, and she was promoted to the rank of superintendent of the women's part of Auschwitz. But in terms of her evil actions at Auschwitz, Elisabeth Volkenrath got involved in the killing processes. She selected prisoners who arrived at the camp to be sent to their deaths inside of the gas chambers as soon as they disembarked from the trains. Those who were not fit enough to work were driven into the chambers, but those who were fit enough to work were processed into Auschwitz. Elisabeth got involved in many different selections, and she was even seen loading prisoners onto the trucks, where they were then driven to the gas chambers. She tried to admit at her trial that she had no idea where these vehicles were heading, but this was a blatant lie. She was known for being a brutal overseer as well, and she treated prisoners terribly and roughly. When she served as a senior guard inside of the women's section of the camp, she was witnessed killing. One former prisoner claimed that she once was beaten so badly by her that she was then sent to the hospital for 3 weeks. It was also said that roughly 80 times that she was seen battering prisoners, and many of these were knocked out as she battered them with her truncheon and weapon. But she also battered some prisoners to death. One woman, Helene Herkowitz, later testified at the Belsen trials about the behaviour of Elisabeth, and she stated that she was interrogated about the fact she had a locket and a ring on her person. She was then ordered to run behind a bike to the SS HQ where Volkenrath was based. But when she arrived, the guard took out her rubber truncheon and then struck her repeatedly before locking her in a cellar, and Herkowitz was only fed a small piece of bread every 3 days and was also given hardly any water. After this, for punishment, she was ordered to clean out the toilets, and she then caught the deadliest disease of typhus and almost died. But further allegations about the behaviour of Elisabeth Volkenrath remained, including that she tortured prisoners by making them do sport, pointless and strenuous exercises as a group punishment. She also was said to have struck women so hard that they fell to the ground, and during one incident she caught a sick girl stealing vegetables and was so offended by this survival behaviour that Volkenrath ordered the girl to kneel and hold the stolen goods above her head for a period of 4 hours. And then, when her arms fell, she was beaten terribly and was knocked out, and no one was allowed to help her. Another incident occurred in which she threw an old woman down some stairs inside of Auschwitz close to a workshop, and then the old lady died from this fall and caused by Volkenrath's brutish behaviour. As the Soviet Red Army advanced towards Auschwitz, there was mass evacuations of the site, and with this she was moved to Bergen-Belsen, and she arrived here on the 5th of February 1945. She was amongst her friends, including the Commandant Josef Kramner, who she knew and worked under at Auschwitz-Birkenau. Whilst here, she claimed that she caught typhus yet again, but the camp was decrepit. There were corpses lying all over the camp, and the guards did not even bother to bury them, and the British later found 10,000 unburied bodies amongst the 60,000 starving and suffering prisoners who were fighting to survive. But amongst the prisoners who were trying to live, there were a number of former guards who tried to hide out. Volkenrath was one of them, but she was handed over to the British and was then ordered to help the British clean up the site, and there are images of her burying the bodies of the victims. But whilst in prison, she was interviewed by guards regularly, but was brought to the Belsen trials to stand accused of crimes against humanity and war crimes. What secured the death sentence of Volkenrath was the fact that she had worked inside of Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen, and there was undeniable compelling evidence that she took part in the selections at Auschwitz, sending people to their deaths. She tried to deny that she had never killed, but this was pointless, and she was condemned for her crimes. It was on the 13th of December 1945, months after the war had come to an end, that inside of Hamelin prison, Elisabeth Volkenrath was taken to her execution. She was guided out of her prison cell by Albert Pierpoint, who she had met the days before, and he had calculated her height and weight, and thus the drop needed to snap her neck when she fell through the gallows. To make the Belsen executions quicker, Pierpoint used a simultaneous gallows, and he executed the women first. It was at 9:34 a.m. that morning that Volkenrath was summoned out of her cell. She walked into the execution chamber, and her identity was confirmed, and then she was helped up the steps of the gallows by the guards. The executioner worked quickly, and he moved the former female guard over the trapdoor and over a chalk mark that he had drawn. Pierpoint then put a cap over Elisabeth Volkenrath's head, and he then secured the noose and tightened it. He released the trapdoor, and she fell, and Volkenrath's execution was swift as her neck snapped as she fell through. Her remains were then buried inside of the courtyard of Hamelin prison, a stone's throw away from where she plunged through the gallows. But what is not as well known is that her bones were actually exhumed and dug up inside of the prison, and she was then buried in a nearby cemetery. Elisabeth Volkenrath's remains are still there today in an unmarked piece of grass, but she was a sadist and a brutal woman who was sent to her execution for her crimes. Thank you for watching, and to support, please remember to subscribe. And again, thank you so much for watching.